Hi students. In this video I want to take a look at the practice exercise number 1.1 and just go through a couple problems to help you figure out exactly what you're doing here. So as it says in the instructions, for each argument we want to symbolize the argument and identify the form that it takes, and then I've listed the sort of form options here. So MP is for modus ponens, MT is for modus tollens, HS is for hypothetical syllogism, AC is affirming the consequent, DA is denying the antecedent. AC and DA, those are invalid forms. MP, MT, and HS are all valid forms. If it's something else, it's probably going to be an invalid form. So after you've done that, you want to indicate whether it's valid or invalid, right? If we know the form, then you know whether it's valid or invalid, and you're going to determine whether the premises are true. Finally, I say indicate whether the argument is sound. And so what it takes for an argument to be sound, it's got to have a valid form, it's got to be valid, and it's got to have true premises. So that's what we're looking for there. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I've done number 0 for you. If Klondike is a polar bear, when we're trying to symbolize an argument like this one, what we want to do is we want to sort of ignore the if and then, and we take the propositions that follow them. So a proposition is just a simple statement, a claim. It expresses a truth value. Klondike is a polar bear. That's either true or false. So Klondike is a mammal. That's either true or false. So these get letters. Klondike is a polar bear. I've just called it A. And Klondike is a mammal. I've called it B. And we have this if something, then something else. We get this sort of arrow. And so that's what I've done right there. If A, then B. Now you don't have to call it A, arrow B if you don't like. Klondike is a polar bear. Maybe you want to call it, maybe say, I'm going to call that P. And Klondike is a mammal. Maybe I'm going to call that M. Maybe that makes more sense to you. And so we want to call this P, arrow M. That's fine. It doesn't really matter. Premise 2, so Klondike is not a polar bear. Okay, so that looks a lot like P, right? Except it says not. So that's going to be not P. And we symbolize that by saying tilde P. So we've got, if Klondike is a polar bear, then Klondike is a mammal. Klondike is not a polar bear, therefore Klondike is not a mammal. Okay, this looks a lot like M, but again, it's just got that not in there. So we get not M. As I've put here, this form is denying the antecedent. Because what happens, we have antecedent comes before the arrow, consequent comes after it. If the antecedent is true, then the consequent is true. This says it's not the case that the antecedent is true. That's how it gets its name. It denies the antecedent of the consequent. And any argument that takes that form, DA, right, said it was an invalid argument. So it's not valid. Okay, now since it's not valid, we know that it's not sound. But I still want you to check for whether the premises are true. So are the premises true? Premise 1, if Klondike is a polar bear, then Klondike is a mammal. So if something's a polar bear, does it guarantee that that thing is a mammal? The answer is yes. So that first premise is true. And when we're evaluating a conditional, we ask ourselves, if the antecedent is true, Klondike's being a polar bear, does that guarantee the truth of the consequent, Klondike's being a mammal? And the answer is yes. Klondike's being a polar bear guarantees Klondike's being a mammal. So premise 1 is true. What about premise 2? Klondike is not a polar bear. Well, okay, who's Klondike? I'm just assuming Klondike is like the ONU mascot. Klondike is a polar bear. That's not a real polar bear, right? But for our purposes, Klondike is a polar bear. So the claim that Klondike is not a polar bear is false. So that's why I've sort of highlighted this. Premise 2 is false. Okay, let's try another one. If Klondike is a polar bear, so again, figure out what's this. Maybe I say that's P, polar bear. If Klondike is a polar bear, then Klondike is a mammal. P, arrow, M. If P, then M. That's symbolized with that arrow. Klondike is not a mammal. Not M. Therefore, Klondike is not a polar bear. I got these not a polar bear, not P. All right. This argument's a little bit different than the previous one, right? The previous one denied the antecedent, DA, that's invalid. But this one denies the consequent. That form is valid. So what you'll want to be keeping an eye on are those valid argument forms. P arrow M is equivalent, right, to if A then B, not B, we're denying the consequent, therefore not A. That argument is modus tollens. So we're going to write that. Modus tollens, as I said, is a valid argument. So it's valid. Now let's go back and evaluate the premises. Does Klondike's being a polar bear guarantee Klondike's being a mammal? Yes. So I'm going to leave that uncircled because premise 1 is true. And then Klondike is not a mammal. Klondike is not a mammal. Well, polar bears are mammals, so Klondike is a mammal. So premise 2 is going to be false. And since we have a false premise, the argument's unsound. Remember, in order to have a sound argument, we've got to have true premises. The argument's got to be valid. If it's got a false premise or the argument's invalid, then it's unsound. Okay, let me skip down here to a different one, maybe number 4. So, if George Washington was killed in battle, we can call this A if we want. We can call it K if we want for killed. Whatever you want to do. Then George Washington is dead. Then we can call this B, or we could call it D for dead. Whatever you want. I think each way of doing it has virtues. If you do it with A and B, then it'll more obviously fit the forms that we have, if that helps you. But I think using K and D is, in a way, helps you recognize what the other statements match. So when we say George Washington's not dead, we can say, oh, D, dead. That's going to be not D or whatever. Okay, so George Washington, I'm going to go with K, arrow D. And then George Washington's not dead, not D. Conclusion, George Washington is not killed in battle, not K. Okay, I'm not going to do much more of that one because it looks like it's modus ponens like the others. Let's do one that's not, that has kind of a different structure here. Maybe I'll do one of these ones down towards the bottom where we get something more like hypothetical syllogism. So, let's try 11. So if Nemo is cold-blooded, then Nemo's a fish. I'm going to say if cold-blooded, then fish. If Nemo's a fish, then a clownfish. Okay, now if a fish, then a clownfish. Well, I already used C for cold-blooded, so I can't really use C again. Clown is going to be N, let's say. conclusion, if Nemo is cold-blooded, then Nemo's a clownfish. All right, so cold-blooded, then a fish. If a fish, then a clownfish. Therefore, if Nemo is cold-blooded, then he's a clownfish. That symbolization looks right. Now, is that a hypothetical syllogism? Oftentimes when we have, arrows in all the premises and the conclusion, right, hypothetical syllogism is the main option we'll be looking for. And the answer is yes. So one way to sort of spot this is that you see, we have C arrow F as one premise, and then F arrow N as the other premise. Whenever we have those two premises, I've just sort of combined them into one line here. The middle can drop out, and so we get C arrow N. So that is what we have as the conclusion. So that is valid, and that is a hypothetical syllogism. If the conclusion was like N arrow C, then that wouldn't be right, because we have C going towards N, not N going towards C. If we had something else like conclusion, therefore P arrow N or whatever, that wouldn't be hypothetical syllogism either. But here we're in good shape. We get the sort of that, the F drops out, C arrow N, good. Hypothetical syllogism, as I put up here, right? It's a valid argument. So we're going to go down here, say, yep, that's valid. Okay, now we're evaluating the premises. If Nemo's cold-blooded, then Nemo is a fish. Is everything that's cold-blooded a fish? No. So that premise is false. If Nemo's a fish, then Nemo's a clownfish. Are all fish clownfish? No, that's false too. Okay, so if we've got valid argument, we've got false premises. Since it's got false premises, we know that it's unsound. All right. I think maybe I'll pause there. If you feel like, oh, okay, I got it, John. Now I'm in good shape. Great, that's excellent. If not, maybe I will do one more just for kicks. Maybe I'll try number 7. So, number 7, it's not the case that George Washington is dead. Now we've got a not. It's not the case that. This is just, can be symbolized with that tilde. It's not the case that. And then here's the preposition. Not the preposition, the proposition. George Washington is dead, not D. If George Washington was killed in battle, okay, then George Washington is dead, D. So this is K arrow D. This is not D. Conclusion, therefore, it's not the case that George Washington was killed in battle. Not the case. George Washington was killed in battle. All right. It seems like I keep finding all the modus tollens ones around here. So that one's modus tollens. One thing that's interesting about this one, right, is that the conditional premise is on line 2. And then the premise that denies the consequent is on line 1. And so note that the order of the premises doesn't matter. So we could flip those around and that'd be fine, or this way is fine. What matters is just that the premises have a conditional claim and the negation of the consequent of that conditional claim. And when we get that, we can conclude the negation of the antecedent of it. Okay, so that's modus tollens. I wanted to try and find one that is like modus tollens. They're pretty straightforward. Okay, 5. George Washington was killed in battle. then he's dead. If killed, battle, then dead. George Washington was killed in battle. K. Therefore, George Washington's dead. D. That's as straightforward as it comes. Modus ponens. Is that argument valid? Yep, all modus ponens arguments are valid. What about the truth of the premises? George Washington was killed in battle, then he's dead. If George Washington was killed in battle, then he's dead. That's guaranteed. Assuming he can't rise from the dead or something like that. When someone's killed in battle, they're dead. That's true. So premise 1 is true. Premise 2, George Washington was killed in battle. Now here we've got to look at what actually happened. Was George Washington killed in battle? And if you do the research here, you'll find out that the answer is no, he wasn't killed in battle. So premise 2 is false. So that argument's unsound as well. Okay, so I've given you a little bit of practice. Hopefully that gives you a sense for how you should approach these. Remember, on questions like this one, you've got to do this stuff. I just haven't done it here. Same here. You've got to fill that out. But you want to go through and fill these things out. Follow my procedure, right? Figuring out how do I symbolize the premises that I have. Once I've symbolized them, what's the argument form? Once I know the argument form, I can tell whether it's a valid argument or an invalid argument. Then once I've figured all that out, that's all about the structure. Then I can go back and look, are these premises true? Are the claims they're making true claims or false claims? If they're true, I don't want to circle anything. If they're false, then I do want to circle those. And then finally, I evaluate soundness by looking at, is the argument valid? It needs to be valid if it's going to be sound, and it needs to have no false premises in order to be sound. All right. I circled this here, but I don't know if that argument's valid or not. I was just illustrating it, so don't get the wrong impression there. All right, hopefully that is helpful if you were struggling at all. And if you've got concerns or if you're confused, we'll have time on Thursday to address some of those questions. All right, have a good one.